Chapter 16 of Mary Barton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Daly, Washington, D.C. Mary Barton by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 16. Meeting between Masters and Workmen. Not for a moment take the scorner's chair. While seated there, thou know'st not a word. A tone, a look, may gall thy brother's heart, and make him turn in bitterness against thee. Love truths. The day arrived on which the masters were to have an interview with the deputation of the workpeople. The meeting was to take place in a public room at an hotel, and there, about 11 o'clock, the mill owners, who had received the foreign orders, began to collect. Of course, the first subject, however full their minds might be of another, was the weather. Having done their duty by all the showers and sunshine which had occurred during the past week, they fell to talking about the business which had brought them together. There might be about 20 gentlemen in the room, including some by courtesy who were not immediately concerned in the settlement of the present question, but who, nevertheless, were sufficiently interested to attend. These were divided into little groups, who did not seem by any means unanimous. Some were for a slight concession, just a sugar-plum to quieten the naughty children, a sacrifice to peace and quietness. Some were steadily and vehemently opposed to the dangerous precedent of yielding one jot or one tittle to the outward force of a turnout. It was teaching the workpeople how to become masters, said they. Did they want the wildest thing hereafter, they would know that the way to obtain their wishes would be to strike work. Besides, one or two of those present had only just returned from the New Bailey, where one of the turnouts had been tried for a cruel assault on a poor north country weaver who had attempted to work at the low price. They were indignant, and justly so, at the merciless manner in which the poor fellow had been treated, and their indignation at wrong took, as it often does, the extreme form of revenge. They felt as if, rather than yield to the body of men who were resorting to such cruel measures towards their fellow workmen, they, the masters, would sooner relinquish all the benefits to be derived from the fulfillment of the commission, in order that the workmen might suffer keenly. They forgot that the strike was, in this instance, the consequence of want and need, suffered unjustly, as the endurers believed. For, however insane, and without ground of reason, such was their belief, and such was the cause of their violence. It is a great truth that you cannot extinguish violence by violence. You may put it down for a time, but while you are crowing over your imaginary success, see if it does not return with 7 devils worse than its former self. No one thought of treating the workmen as brethren and friends, and openly, clearly, as appealing to reasonable men, stating exactly and fully the circumstances which led the masters to think it was the wise policy of the time to make sacrifices themselves and to hope for them from the operatives. In going from group to group in the room, you caught such a medley of sentences as the following. Poor devils, they're near enough to starving, I'm afraid. Mrs. Aldred makes 2 cows' heads into soup every week, and people come many miles to fetch it, and if these times last, we must try and do more. But we must not be bullied into anything. A rise of a shilling or so won't make much difference, and they will go away thinking they've gained their point. And that's the very thing I object to. They'll think so, and whenever they've got a point to gain, no matter how unreasonable, they'll strike work. It really injures them more than us. I don't see how our interests can be separated. The demmed brute had thrown vitriol on the poor fellow's ankles, and you know what a bad part that is to heal. He had to stand still with the pain, and that left him at the mercy of the cruel wretch, who beat him about the head till you'd hardly have known he was a man. They doubt if he'll live. If it were only for that, I'll stand out against them, even if it is the cause of my ruin. I for one won't yield 1 farthing to the cruel brutes. They're more like wild beasts than human beings. Well, who might have made them different? I say, Carson, just go and tell Duncombe of this fresh instance of their abominable conduct. He's wavering, but I think this will decide him. The door was now opened, and the waiter announced that the men were below, and asked if it were the pleasure of the gentlemen that they should be shown up. They assented, and rapidly took their places round the official table, looking as like they could to the Roman senators who awaited the eruption of Brennus and his Gauls. Tramp, tramp, came the heavy clogged feet up the stairs, and in a minute 5 wild, earnest-looking men stood in the room. John Barton, from some mistake as to time, was not among them. Had they been larger-boned men, you would have called them gaunt. As it was, they were little of stature, and their fustian clothes hung loosely about their shrunk limbs. In choosing their delegates, too, the operatives had had more regard to their brains and power of speech than to their wardrobes. They might have read the opinions of that worthy Professor Trufelstreck in Sartor Resartus, to judge from the dilapidated coats and trousers which yet clothed men of parts and of power. It was long since many of them had known the luxury of a new article of dress, and air gaps were to be seen in their garments. Some of the masters were rather affronted at such a ragged detachment coming between the wind and their nobility, but what cared they? At the request of a gentleman hastily chosen to officiate as chairman, the leader of the delegates read, in a high-pitched, psalm-singing voice, a paper containing the operative's statement of the case at issue, their complaints, and their demands, which last were not remarkable for moderation. He was then desired to withdraw for a few minutes with his fellow delegates to another room, while the masters considered what should be their definite answer. When the men had left the room, a whispered, earnest consultation took place, everyone re-urging his former arguments. The conceders carried the day, but only by a majority of one. The minority haughtily and audibly expressed their dissent from the measures to be adopted. Even after the delegates re-entered the room, their words and looks did not pass unheeded by the quick-eyed operatives. Their names were registered in bitter hearts. The masters would not consent to the advance demanded by the workmen. They would agree to give 1 shilling per week more than they had previously offered. Were the delegates empowered to accept such an offer? They were empowered to accept or decline any offer made that day by the masters. Then it might be as well for them to consult among themselves as to what should be their decision. They again withdrew. It was not for long. They came back, and positively declined any compromise of their demands. Then up sprang Mr. Henry Carson, the head and voice of the violent party among the masters, and addressing the chairman, even before the scowling operatives, he proposed some resolutions which he, and those who agreed with him, had been concocting during this last absence of the deputation. They were, firstly, withdrawing the proposal just made, and declaring all communication between the masters and that particular trades union at an end. Secondly, declaring that no master would employ any workman in future unless he signed a declaration that he did not belong to any trades union, and pledged himself not to assist or subscribe to any society having for its object interference with the master's powers. And thirdly, that the masters should pledge themselves to protect and encourage all workmen willing to accept employment on those conditions, and at the rate of wages first offered. Considering that the men who now stood listening with lowered brows of defiance were all of them leading members of the Union, which resolutions were in themselves sufficiently provocative of animosity, but not content with simply stating them, Harry Carson went on to characterize the conduct of the workmen in no measured terms, every word he spoke rendering their looks more livid, their glaring eyes more fierce. One among them would have spoken, but checked himself, in obedience to the stern glance and pressure on his arm received from the leader. Mr. Carson sat down, and a friend instantly got up to second the motion. It was carried, but far from unanimously. The chairman announced it to the delegates, who had been once more turned out of the room for a division. They received it with deep, brooding silence, but spake never a word, and left the room without even a bow. Now, there had been some by-play at this meeting, not recorded in the Manchester newspapers, which gave an account of the more regular part of the transaction. While the men had stood grouped near the door on their first entrance, Mr. Harry Carson had taken out his silver pencil, and had drawn an admirable caricature of them, lank, ragged, dispirited, and famine-stricken. Underneath he wrote a hasty quotation from the fat knight's well-known speech in Henry IV. He passed it to one of his neighbours, who acknowledged the likeness instantly, and by him it was sent round to others, who all smiled and nodded their heads, and when it came back to its owner, he tore the back of the letter on which it was drawn in two, twisted them up, and flung them into the fireplace. But, careless whether they reached their aim or not, he did not look to see that they fell just short of any consuming cinders. This proceeding was closely observed by one of the men. He watched the masters as they left the hotel, laughing, some of them were, at passing jokes. And when all had gone, he re-entered. He went to the waiter, who recognized him. "There's a bid on a picture up yonder, as one of the gentlemen threw away. I've a little lad at home as dearly loves a picture. By your leave, I'll go up for it." The waiter, good-natured and sympathetic, accompanied him upstairs, saw the paper, picked it up, and untwisted. And then, being convinced, by a hasty glance at its contents, that it was only what the man had called it, a bit of a picture, he allowed him to bear away his prize. Towards 7 o'clock that evening, many operatives began to assemble in a room in the Weaver's Arms public-house. a room appropriated for